internal disagreement between EU and NATO, Belgium announced that it is ready to sue the Union or any country that forces Belgium to transfer frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Join me today. Belgium's decision to openly challenge the European Commission's plan to use Russia's frozen sovereign assets marks one of the most significant internal ruptures within the EU since the war began. Prime Minister Bart de Wever's letter to Ursula von der Leyen is not a symbolic protest. It is a structural warning from the country that hosts Euroclear, the financial institution holding the bulk of Russia's immobilized reserves. Belgium is essentially saying the EU is playing with fire and we will not be the ones burned for it. At the heart of Belgium's objection lies a deep legal concern. Under both EU and international law, sovereign assets enjoy strong protections, including state immunity. Belgium fears that transforming frozen assets into active funding for Ukraine crosses the line from administrative freezing, which is widely accepted, to expropriation, which could be struck down in international courts. This is not abstract theory. Russia has already signaled it will challenge any seizure in arbitration tribunals and retaliate economically. Financial exposure intensifies Belgium's caution. Euroclear controls roughly 190 billion in Russian assets, making Belgium the country most vulnerable to countermeasures. If Europe seizes the funds, Euroclear could face decades of litigation and become a direct target for Russian retaliation, including asset seizures within Russia or even punitive regulatory actions. Finally, Belgium fears the long-term implications for the European financial system. Confiscating sovereign reserves, even from an adversary, sets a precedent that could undermine global trust in Europe as a stable, rules-based financial hub. Non-Western sovereign wealth funds will rethink their exposure. Belgium understands that once this precedent is established, the damage is irreversible. Thus, de Wever's intervention reveals a fundamental contradiction. Europe wants to punish Russia while also preserving the legitimacy of its own financial order. Belgium is arguing that the EU cannot have both. Belgium's challenge did not arise in a vacuum. It is the latest expression of a widening split inside the EU and NATO over how far Europe should go in sustaining Ukraine's war effort and in confronting Russia economically. What appears on the surface to be a dispute about frozen assets is actually a symptom of a deeper strategic divergence. Different risk calculations, different economic interests, and different political tolerances across the continent. First, EU members are divided by geography and historical memory. The eastern flank, Poland, the Baltic states, and Czechia views Russia as an existential threat. For them, seizing Russian assets is not only legally justifiable, but strategically necessary. These states prioritize deterrence over long-term financial precedents, believing that only maximum pressure on Moscow can prevent future aggression. Their logic is shaped by proximity. In contrast, Western European economies, Belgium, Austria, Italy, and a significant bloc inside Germany and France, see the world through a different lens. Their economies are more integrated with global financial markets, more sensitive to legal uncertainty, and substantially more exposed to the consequences of weaponizing sovereign reserves. For these states, the risk is not simply Russia. The risk is undermining Europe's credibility as a safe financial jurisdiction for the global South and major sovereign investors like the Gulf states and China. Belgium's letter reflects these systemic concerns. Second, U.S. pressure complicates the picture. Washington strongly favors transferring Russian assets to Ukraine, reducing fiscal burdens on Congress, signaling resolve in weakening Russia's balance sheet. But while the United States can absorb potential legal disputes, Europe would bear the brunt of retaliation. Belgium interprets this as asymmetry. The U.S. benefits geopolitically, while Europe absorbs financial liability. Third, the EU's internal economic challenges push member states toward divergent priorities. Slowing growth, deindustrialization pressures, and rising public spending create political fatigue. For many Western governments, confiscating Russian assets becomes a sign of strategic desperation rather than strategic coherence. The dispute also spills into NATO. Those pushing hardest for asset seizure are the same members urging more assertive military escalation. Meanwhile, Western European capitals quietly signal their discomfort with unlimited commitments. The frozen asset debate exposes what diplomats prefer to hide. NATO unity is increasingly a performance rather than a reality. Ultimately, the EU's divisions are not about money alone. They reflect conflicting visions of Europe's role in the world, a continent of strict legalism and financial predictability, or an assertive geopolitical actor willing to bend its own rules. Belgium's intervention shows that this contradiction can no longer be contained. Belgium's resistance does more than complicate EU financial policy. It offers Russia a strategic opening that aligns perfectly with Moscow's long-term war doctrine. Since February 2022, Russia's core diplomatic strategy has rested on a simple assumption: the West will fracture before Russia collapses. Every internal dispute inside the EU or NATO is therefore not just a political event, it is a validation of Moscow's broader approach. First, the Belgian objection strengthens Russia's long-standing argument that Western sanctions rest on shaky legal grounds. Moscow has insisted that asset freezes violate international norms, and Belgium's letter issued by the state that hosts Euroclear provides indirect reinforcement. Russia can now frame Europe as internally divided over the legality of its own actions. This narrative resonates strongly in the global South, where governments are skeptical of Western dominance in international finance. Second, the internal split gives Russia leverage at future negotiations, whether informal or formal. A fragmented West sends a signal to Moscow that the political appetite for continued escalation is diminishing. Belgium's refusal suggests that some states fear the long-term costs of isolating Russia more than they fear Russian expansionism. This shift strengthens Moscow's hand in bargaining for territorial concessions or sanctions relief. Simply put, when Western unity falters, Russia's demands carry greater weight. Third, Russia will use this moment to deepen its outreach to BRICS, ASEAN, and Middle Eastern partners. Highlighting EU uncertainty allows Russia to argue that Western financial institutions are unreliable custodians, an argument with profound diplomatic implications. The more Europe appears divided, the more persuasive Russia becomes in encouraging de-dollarization, diversification of reserves, and alternative payment systems. Belgium's objection becomes a geopolitical talking point. Fourth, military timing matters. When Russia perceives fractures within NATO, it historically accelerates its ground operations. Moscow may interpret this conflict over frozen assets as evidence that Europe is reaching the limits of its political and financial endurance. If the Kremlin believes Western support is weakening, it has a rational incentive to intensify operations to improve its bargaining position before a potential diplomatic phase. Finally, the psychological impact cannot be overstated. Unity as a strategic asset, division is a strategic gift. Belgium's stance allows Russia to say, both domestically and internationally, that the Western coalition is no longer monolithic. And in negotiations, perception is often as powerful as reality. In essence, what looks like a financial disagreement is, from Moscow's perspective, a strategic inflection point, one that enhances Russia's confidence and negotiating leverage at a critical phase of the conflict. The clash triggered by Belgium's objection is not simply a dispute over Russian assets. It is a revelation of Europe's more profound structural crisis. The EU is confronting the limits of its institutional design, torn between its identity as a rules-based economic union and its desire to act as a geopolitical power amid war. The frozen assets controversy exposes the unresolved contradiction at the heart of Europe's strategic posture. Europe built its prosperity on predictability, stable institutions, legal certainty, strong property rights, and the perception that capital, whether private or sovereign, was safe inside European jurisdictions. This reputation is not theoretical. It is the foundation upon which global investors, sovereign wealth funds, and multinational banks have trusted Europe for decades. Belgium's resistance reflects a fear that weaponizing sovereign reserves would fundamentally erode this trust. The EU's challenge is that geopolitical pressure is pushing it in the opposite direction. The war in Ukraine has forced Europe to adopt unprecedented sanctions, export controls, and energy restrictions. As the conflict drags on, member states are debating whether the EU must transform itself into a more assertive geopolitical actor, one willing to bend long-standing legal norms in the name of security. The frozen assets plan symbolizes this shift, a move from economic orthodoxy to geopolitical experimentation. Yet the legal concerns are substantial. Confiscating sovereign assets without a UN mandate risks undermining international law, particularly the doctrines of state immunity and property rights that Europe has long defended. If Europe violates principles, it expects others to uphold its credibility in future disputes, whether with China, Turkey, or Gulf states, weakens dramatically. Belgium's objection highlights this contradiction. The West cannot champion a rules-based order while selectively suspending those rules. Domestic politics compound the problem. With inflation, energy insecurity, and fiscal pressures rising, governments face growing public skepticism about the long-term costs of supporting Ukraine. The idea of using Russian assets becomes a substitute for political consensus, a financial shortcut, masking strategic fatigue. Belgium's position exposes that shortcut and forces Europe to confront the uncomfortable truth. There is no cost-free path to sustaining the war effort. Finally, the dispute reveals a deeper question. What kind of global actor does Europe want to be? A legalist power rooted in economic stability, or a geopolitical bloc willing to take unprecedented risks? Belgium's intervention suggests that Europe has not yet reconciled these identities, and that the consequences of failing to do so may shape the continent's role in global politics for decades. The dispute over Russian frozen assets is more than a financial disagreement. It is a window into the weakening cohesion of NATO and the EU at a pivotal moment in the Ukraine conflict. Belgium's resistance exposes a truth long whispered in diplomatic circles. The Western alliance is no longer marching in lockstep, and where unity erodes, Russia's negotiating leverage inevitably grows. NATO's strength has always rested on political consensus, not just military capability. When countries openly disagree over escalation, sanctions, or financial measures, it signals to Moscow that Western resolve is fragmenting. Belgium's refusal to endorse asset seizure demonstrates that even core Western institutions, Euroclear, the European Commission, and NATO members are not aligned on how far they are willing to push legal and geopolitical boundaries. For Russia, this is a strategic gift. On the battlefield, disunity translates into uncertainty for Ukraine. Kyiv depends heavily on Western military aid, macro financial support, and coordinated sanctions pressure. When NATO members cannot agree on something as fundamental as the use of frozen assets, Ukrainian officials quietly fear that broader support may also become conditional, delayed, or politically contested. Russia understands this psychological dynamic and uses it to erode Ukrainian morale and Western confidence. Diplomatically, Moscow gains leverage because a divided West cannot sustain the same negotiating pressure. If Belgium and potentially other states refuse to participate in asset confiscation, Russia can seize on these divisions to demand concessions at future diplomatic talks. It can be argued that sanctions are legally fragile, politically contested, and unsustainable over the long term. A fractured coalition is easier to negotiate against than a unified bloc. Economically, Russia can amplify these divisions by threatening retaliation against specific European states, reinforcing already existing disagreements inside the EU. Some states fear economic blowback more than strategic escalation, and Russia's targeted threats deepen this divide. Diplomatically, Moscow gains leverage because a divided West cannot sustain the same negotiating pressure. If Belgium and potentially other states refuse to participate in asset confiscation, Russia can seize on these divisions to demand concessions at future diplomatic talks. It can be argued that sanctions are legally fragile, politically contested, and unsustainable over the long term. A fractured coalition is easier to negotiate against than a unified bloc. Economically, Russia can amplify these divisions by threatening retaliation against specific European states, reinforcing already existing disagreements inside the EU. Some states fear economic blowback more than strategic escalation, and Russia's targeted threats deepen this divide. In great power politics, unity is a form of power, and division is a form of surrender. Moscow understands this well. The question now is whether Europe understands it too. Thank you for watching.